everyone, and welcome. I'm Claire Meany and I'm Director of Waterford Healing Arts Trust. On behalf of the Well Festival of Arts and Wellbeing Partners, I'm thrilled to welcome you all to the Well Festival Keynote Why Arts, and to our very special guests, Dr. Paul Finucane and Gemma Tipton. You've just seen a short video of the Union Hall collection, which is owned by Paul and Aileen Finucane and on loan to University Hospital Waterford. The accompanying music in the video is Inisheer by Thomas Walsh, and that's being performed by our Healing Sounds musicians Owen O'Mara, Liam Merriman, Alan Brown, Liam Kavanagh and Michelle Haberlin. And thank you to my colleague Aileen Kennedy, who has created the film. The Union Hall collection is an extraordinary collection of paintings by some of Ireland's leading artists, and we're extremely grateful to Paul and his wife Aileen for this loan. The artwork has been installed less than a week and it's receiving amazing feedback already from the hospital community. And I'm very excited to hear Paul talk more about this and the significance of the arts in his life. So this event has been brought to you by the Well Festival of Arts and Wellbeing, and the festival celebrates all the ways the arts can make us feel good, and it's presented by Waterford Healing Arts Trust, Garter Lane Arts Centre and Waterford City and County Libraries. The Well Festival is funded by the Arts Council, the HSE and Waterford City and County Council. I'm now delighted to hand you over to Gemma Tipton. Gemma contributes to the Irish Times on art, architecture and various aspects of culture, and we're absolutely thrilled that you are here with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you all for joining us. I wonder how many more sessions we'll be having via Zoom. There's a beautiful sense of things opening up, but it's not without attendant anxieties. And I'm really aware, particularly with events like this, where you're seeing into people's living rooms, that new space that's opened up where you're absolutely with people in a way while you're separated from them. But I mean, off on a different tangent, fascinating to me, the art that people have behind them. Apparently there was a boom in art sales as people realized their Zoom backdrops mightn't be up to standard and they all started investing in things. But that's a different point to what we're going to talk about today. I do think the last 2 years have thrown us back very much on our own resources. And at the same time, without the noisy distractions of the world, a lot of people, myself included, have started to realize how much art really, really matters. I think if we'll all remember that Seamus Heaney quote about wintering out from 2 years ago, and the resources that art gives us to reflect and find a little space to think in the midst of anxiety and perhaps fear is really vital. And that's why art matters. I mean, I'm obviously really passionate about it. In my own background, my father's a biochemist and my mum worked in IMA and at the Douglas side. So our conversations at home were all very much free-flowing and took in the sciences. Dad actually taught Luke O'Neill, so we had loads of conversations about, but they always sort of came back to art and they were never separated. And that's one reason, and I never found a reason to separate them. I wish I had been taught differently in school and realized how creative science was. And that's why I'm so delighted to be speaking with Dr. Paul Finucane, because throughout his career, he has been a medical doctor in geriatric medicine for more than 40 years in Ireland and around the world. He's also very involved in education. Emeritus professor at Limerick University, he helped to establish a new medical school there in 2007. But he has, alongside or knitted into that, a profound interest in the humanities. And he's written books on art, is co-editor with Shane O'Hanlon of Emergence, which is a very beautiful anthology of poetry and prose about wisdom and resilience and aging. And if you're inspired by the end of today and you don't have it already, you can buy it online at emergenceanthology.com. And he's also an art collector. We saw a video clip of his Union Hall collection, which we're going to be talking about a little bit further. So let's begin. Paul, I'd love to ask you a little bit about your own background and your parallel or separate journeys into art and into medicine.
Yeah, I suppose like with many things in my life, Gemma, I drifted into both, I would say, into arts and into medicine. Maybe to start off by talking about my drift into medicine, I did the Leaving Cert 50 years ago, so 1972, and I was 16, and I think a pretty immature 16-year-old without really much of an idea of what I wanted to do in life. And I come from a fairly large family. I was the second youngest of a family of 8. I had an older brother who did medicine and seemed to quite enjoy a life in medicine. He was the bright spark in the family. So there was a notion that I might try to follow in his footsteps. So without kind of much of a clue of what I was doing, I embarked in a medical course in UCC. That was not long after the days when you could rock up to UCC on the day in which people were registering and decide there and then what course you wanted to do, whether you wanted to do law or whether you wanted to do engineering. And there are all kinds of colourful stories about people deciding on the day what they wanted to do. It wasn't quite like that for me, but it was a bit like that. I'm sure nowadays, if I rocked up for an interview for a medical school and they asked me why I wanted to study medicine, I kind of look fairly blankly at them. If they asked me if I understood what a career in medicine involved, I'm sure I'd be able to flunk that question, and so on and so forth. But to be fair, medicine has been fantastic. It's a wonderful, wonderful career for all kinds of reasons. But that's really, I kind of drifted into it as an immature 16-year-old. And equally, the arts, so I'm talking a lot, Gemma, so you'll be able to interrupt me, I'm sure, but into the arts, that very much was something I drifted into. Certainly growing up, didn't have much of a stimulus in any of the arts, really. I mean, the focus always was on academic achievement. My father was a school teacher, very well intentioned, but his idea of, how you apply yourself was get out the books and do a card of sums rather than, be looking at a painting or reading a book. Certainly my undergraduate education was a culture-free and art-free zone right through. I suppose Aileen and I, our early years together, I don't think I set foot in an art gallery until I was well into my 30s. I'd love to say that I was into literature and poetry, but I wasn't. I mean, I suspect, in all of medical school, I might have read 1 or 2 novels at most. But it was actually my time in Australia where I had friends who were artists, and then getting to know artists. And that was really, I think, what caused me to drift into that area. Because once you get to meet people and know people, you then have an interest in acquiring some of their work. And it kind of grew from there. But it's really been in the past, 25 or 30 years that I've kind of wandered into this space and found it absolutely fantastic and enriching. And I found it such an extraordinary dimension to my life. And I tried to enthuse others into what the arts in its broadest has to offer, certainly the visual arts, but equally the dramatic arts, literature, poetry, performing arts, music, all of these things. But I come to it from a very, I suppose, uneducated background and have tried to educate myself in the arts. So that's a very long-winded answer. My apologies.
Sometimes in the arts, people with a very educated background are art's worst enemies, so I wouldn't worry about that.
Yeah, the advantages of naivety. I'd like to. I'm not sure I could argue that convincingly, but we'll take it.
And I suppose that brings us into the two strands, or of all the strands, two of the strands in how art is so important to our mental and physical and emotional well-being. In one, there's, which we could perhaps talk about, there's the chance for abstract thought and meditation and contemplation. But then there's a more directed route where in clinical and healing settings. And I'd love it if we could unpack each of them a little.
And maybe we might get into it by a personal reflection, Gemma, because again, if I think we'd had this conversation at the time that I was going into medical school as a 16-year-old, or even as a junior doctor as a 26-year-old, and possibly even as a less junior doctor as a 36-year-old, I'd have struggled to understand what you were saying and what you were asking. I did absolutely sign up to the notion that the practice of medicine was a science, and the more you knew and the more skillful you were, the better you were as a doctor. And it's taken me a while, I think, to come around to understanding that as along with knowledge and skills, you actually need attitudes to complement that. And you need to have a focus on the human side of medical practice. You know, the notion that the person with the illness is every bit as important, if not more important, than the illness in the person. And I do remember a couple of people trying to instill that notion in me as a young doctor, notably Bill Shannon, who subsequently became a great friend. And, you know, he was very involved in the humanities and medicine and tried to promote it. And I think, like everybody else who came in contact with him initially, we all thought this was madness. You know, what we needed was to know more about pharmacology and more about anatomy and more about biochemistry. And I think it took time for me, certainly, to appreciate, you know, the dimension that the humanities have to offer to medical practice.
And on top of that, there's, I mean, obviously empathy is huge and important, but art training, and I know they're doing it in Yale and also I believe in some of the teaching areas in James's, using art to teach observational skills for medics.
Yeah, I think it has so many dimensions, Gemma. Maybe again, personal reflection, but I first started to, you know, the light started to dawn when I came across art therapists for the first time while working in the UK, and saw specifically in a stroke rehabilitation unit where I was working, how an art therapist was able to engage with patients who'd had a stroke in a way that nobody else in the team was. And I remember one lady in particular who'd had a devastating stroke and was left with paralysis of one side of her body and an inability to communicate verbally. And she'd not been a painter, but was profoundly depressed, as you might well expect. And an art therapist came along and suddenly opened this amazing window into her life and allowed her to express herself in painting. And that to me was a road to Damascus moment. So I think my first realization of what the arts had to offer was in relation to patient contact. But subsequently, I think I've come to appreciate what it means to health practitioners as well, and the notion that you can make people better healers by helping them through the arts in its various forms. I'm not sure again if that's answering your question, but
I mean, we opened the session with that lovely slideshow of works from your Union Hall collection. And as I understand it, that's on loan. Where has it been lent to currently?
It's just moved from CUH in Cork to UHW in Waterford, but it has been in public hospital settings for the past 10 years, Gemma, starting off in the University Hospital in Limerick, where I then worked for a number of years. And then it moved to CUH in Cork, and it was in the Cancer Centre, the Glandore Centre in the hospital, which is appropriate really because the scene is actually Glandore Harbour. So there was a cemetery there, you know, in the Glandore Centre, which is the oncology centre at Cork University Hospital. And then it's continuing its journey, planning to spend 3 years at UHW, and the Waterford Healing Arts Trust have been so fantastic in facilitating that. So many thanks to everybody there.
How many works in that? I know it's growing and it's a never-ending project.
Yeah, something 30-35 at the minute, and we continue to add to it. Usually 2 or 3 new works a year. So we have actually a work in stained glass on the way, which is quite exciting because we already have a work in ceramic, and there's one in knitted yarn, and there's one in tapestry, you know, to add to the standard, you know, the more usual media of watercolor and oil and acrylics and pastels. So again, you know, the thing that most fascinates Aileen and myself about it all is the diversity of approaches that the artists have taken, both in how they, you know, address the subject, and indeed in the media that they use, and even in the way in which they frame their paintings, for example.
Well, I think it's a wonderful metaphor for everything we're talking about, in that it's available for people who are in hospital, whether for long or short stays, to get a window into the outside world, and a very beautiful window at that. But it also underlines, from what we were talking about, teaching art as a clinical tool, so many different ways you can see exactly the same view. I know I'd been interviewing Sean McCann about teaching art observation, and one of his points was, if you're teaching trainee doctors to look at a skin rash, you want them to look beyond the immediate obvious diagnosis sometimes.
Yes, and Sean and his wife Brenda have been pioneers in this area, and really have, I suppose, made it acceptable as well, because somebody of Sean's persona and his profile in Irish medicine, for somebody like him to take an interest in the arts and to point out its importance has, I think, been enormously useful. But I think you're right. I think, you can approach the arts on a number of levels. At the kind of basic level, I think, something that's decorative, and I wouldn't want to trivialize the importance of that. I do think the clinical environments, hospitals, can be quite intimidating and forbidding for many people, and anything that helps to soften that, I think, is valuable. But what you're talking about, Gemma, is going beyond that to something that actually maybe makes people reflect on the human condition. I've got a friend, an artist, Vivian Bogan, and she talks about the irritant effect of, actually it was Elizabeth Cope, and she talks about the irritant effect of art, and she says that art should be like the grain of sand in an oyster that creates a pearl. So it's not an irritant for irritant's sake, but it's an irritant because it generates something which is a pearl that wouldn't be there otherwise. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful metaphor. And certainly in the medical school in UL, we have a medical art collection, which is precisely there to do that, to maybe stop students in their tracks and to get them to pause and to get them to, talk about. And I mean, some of the paintings in the medical school are quite challenging, and I think would be difficult to put into a clinical site and might distress patients or might distress visitors. So I think, horses for courses, and there are things that can be used in different settings that, so the medical art collection in UL, I think is useful in that regard.
I think that's a really good point. And I'm a big fan of Venn diagrams. And I think there's so many different contexts and kinds of art. And perhaps people who haven't spent as much time up close and personal with it don't necessarily understand that you're just not going to shove anything into a hospital ward.
Yes, absolutely.
Is there a problem, or have you found through your own work and the brilliant work of the people at Waterford Healing Arts Trust that the door is more open? I think just in that idea of medicine as a science, and even to take that word clinical, which boils down to being so cut and dried, the impacts of art are much harder to measure.
Unquestionably. I mean, I think, anything that has to do with attitudinal learning and perceptions are, as you say, difficult to measure, and therefore tend to be disregarded. The notion that you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. I mean, I don't subscribe to that. I go 180 degrees in the opposite direction and say, that these things are, so very, very important, and the fact that you can't necessarily measure them. But again, it depends on how you mean by how you measure. I mean, quantitatively, huge difficulties. Qualitatively, maybe you can get some inroads into it there. But I have absolutely no doubt in my mind, but that the arts in its various forms, literature, poetry, dramatic arts, can make a profound difference to people's lives, and that applies to patients, it applies to health professionals as well.
And have you found during the course of your career that the acceptance of that is growing, or are you still having to push hard for it?
I think you probably have three groups of people. You have those who understand and really need no persuasion as to the value of art. I think you also have a hardcore of people who, believe that this is absolute waste of time. And certainly in a medical school in UL, we came across a small subset of students year on year who were absolutely outraged at the notion of having a stream of the humanities in the course, and tried very hard to undermine confidence in it. But, you know, it would be literally a handful each year. And then I think the great majority would have an open mind. And for many, many of those, once they kind of experience it, they come to understand the value of it. I do think there is a movement, and, you know, there's journals and seminars. Des O'Neill has one tomorrow in Trinity College, where he's got somebody from Australia coming to talk about humanities in medicine in Australia. So it's a worldwide phenomenon. You talked yourself about what's happening in the US. So I think all countries now are slowly coming to realize and sharing their ideas with one another. So you're getting, I think, you know, a united approach to it all. So I think it's going to be an ongoing crusade, but I think certainly it's more understood now than it would have been 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Do you think perhaps that rather extreme antipathy to it has to do with being afraid of uncertainty?
Yes, I think that's very, very true, Gemma. I do think that tolerance of ambiguity and the ability to deal with uncertainty is something that a lot of people struggle with. Curiously enough, in a lot of medical schools where they have interviews of prospective students, they focus very deliberately on ambiguity and the ability of a prospective students to deal with ambiguity, because of course clinical practice is all about ambiguity and trying to make the very best decisions that can be made in an uncertain situation. And I think, again, the arts have an important role in that. You know, just getting people outside of their comfort zone and outside of the concrete, you know, 1 and 1 is 2 into, well, you know, again, I'm being a bit incoherent, but I think you get the gist of what I'm trying to say. But it's to vehemently agree with you that tolerance of ambiguity is something that's crucially important, I think, in a well-functioning health professional. You know, if you are a health professional and you have intolerance of ambiguity, I think there are ways in which you can survive as a health professional, but maybe not have the cold face in direct patient care. You know, maybe.
I think something perhaps that the pandemic has taught us, and I do believe it's a weird phraseology. I think we've been lucky to experience it in Ireland because we're a small enough society that we still have strong community, and the channels of care for one another it's opened up have been very warm. But it's also enabled us to see, I think there was a veering in discourse that science was absolute and that scientists had all the answers. And I think we've got better over the last 18 months at realizing that scientists are doing their best.
Yes, I mean, I absolutely understand what you're saying, and there has been a silver lining to that particularly nasty cloud, without question, Gemma. Of course, it has been, from very many people, as you well know, a very nasty cloud. But I think, yeah, there have been some positives, and along the lines that you've mentioned, for sure.
I mean, I suppose what I'm saying is, if it can leave us with a more open attitude, I loved the way you put it, of a tolerance of ambiguity. But I just wanted, before we open things up to questions, come back to the Union Hall collection. And how did it start, and how do you choose people? Or do people now come knocking on your door going, "Oi, can I paint your view?" Yeah.
So again, a roundabout answer to a straightforward question, Gemma, my apologies, but I'm reminded of my former colleague and friend in UL, the late, great Micheál O'Sullivan. And Micheál was just the most extraordinary man. But he had a notion that in life, all of us are offered opportunities on a very regular basis. And his idea was that for many, many people, they actually fail to recognize or turn their back on opportunity. And what he would always advocate for himself and for others is to allow things to happen. And so I think that very much applies to the Union Hall collection. So it's a project that kind of, very quickly developed its own momentum. And all we did was, in the best advice of Michal Sudabon, kind of stood back and allowed it to happen. Now, to some extent, we had to facilitate it and give it a little bit of a nudge from time to time. But it did develop a momentum of its own, and and still carries that momentum. So that's all good.
And do you find it's changed the way you see? I live in Kinsale, and it's temporary, but it's been temporary for 10 years. And it's a bit of a slog, the 3.5 hours up and down to Dublin. But I always remind myself, never get bored of this view. Yes. Never be grumpy coming over this hill. And that's enabled me to see it differently in pretty much all the time. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about the Union Hall collection. Has there been a particular work that's changed irrevocably how you see your view?
No, I don't think so, to be honest. I mean, people often ask, what's your favourite? And what I genuinely say is I don't have a favourite. The whole idea behind it is to see how different artists respond in a different way to the same stimulus, and the variety of the approaches taken is the thing that has fascinated Aileen and myself most, and continues to fascinate us. So I don't think we've reached saturation level yet where we're getting just more of the same, and certainly something coming now in stained glass will be fascinating to see what the person comes up with. So it's for every artist, I think you've got a different approach, and it's just
Did
amazing.
Did you ever
to
get
see.
any come in and you thought, oh my God, I really don't like that, but then it grew on you?
I can't think that we've had. I mean, certainly we've had one that have had a wow factor for us. I mean, it's amazing how. I might just tell one anecdote if I've got time. So there's a friend of ours in the village, and this village has a very much a Protestant and a Catholic community that have lived harmoniously since forever, but have had different schooling. And this friend of ours happens to be Protestant, and would go swimming with her Catholic friends. And the Catholic friends, as soon as they got into the water at the bottom of our house, would automatically bless themselves. So she found herself growing up blessing herself when she got into the water as well. And we did have an exhibition of the first 20-odd paintings in the Union Hall collection. And she saw the painting, or she just noticed the painting by Michael McCarthy, one of the artists, and found herself blessing herself when she saw the painting. So I think, paintings do have, extraordinary impacts on people. I mean, that's just one story. You could have 500,000 stories quite similar to that. But I wouldn't for a moment underestimate the ability of something on a piece of canvas, a bit of pigment on a piece of canvas, to have an extraordinary impact on the human condition. Another painting that we have by a friend of ours, Christine Terry, of a funeral scene, and somebody came into the house one day and absolutely broke down in floods of tears when he saw the painting, said it reminded him of his father, who died many years previously, and as a small child he was at the father's funeral, and that scene vividly evoked his father's funeral, and just decompensated. Again, it's extraordinary, Gemma. You might be able to explain it better than I, but why is it that pigment on canvas or pigment on board can, or indeed, a short story or a poem by Seamus Heaney or somebody else, can evoke such extraordinary emotions?
I don't think it's an explanation, but I do think, given that 90% of our communication is nonverbal, and so much of the way our brains work are pre-language and pre-verbal, an image can cut through the noise and give us access to stuff we didn't even have the words for. But speaking of having the words for things, we have a question in. Caroline Schofield would love to know if you keep some of the paintings from the collection on your own walls. Like, will the glass one live at home before it's let go?
What we tend to do is to deliver the paintings once a year. So so paintings would be with us, say, for a few months before we hand them on. But I'm afraid we're long past the day where we've got room and walls for paintings. We're not quite up to the situation that poor old Abdul and Catherine Bulbulia find themselves in Woodstone and Waterford, but we do have paintings, under the bed and in cupboards, and not quite in the bath just yet, but getting to a stage where there are just more paintings than we can possibly deal with. So we don't have a space in reserve for the latest addition to the collection, I'm afraid.
Any other questions? Can you suggest, this is from Joe Brennan, touching on our conversation about not being able to quantify the impact of the arts, can you suggest ways for artists and arts organisations to be stronger advocates or more effective advocates for the arts?
Off the top of my head, thanks for the question, Joe. I think it's probably power in numbers and power by association. So I would have thought that the more that people with an interest in the arts, be they practitioners like Joe, or be they, people in positions of influence with sympathy towards the arts. I mean, the more that these people talk to one another and empower one another, and I think maybe to a fault, and Joe himself might have a view on this. A lot of people working, as I understand it, in the arts and the healing environment are isolated, and that shouldn't be the case. I mean, I suppose the time in my career where I most had a practitioner as a member of the multidisciplinary team was in the stroke unit that I alluded to in Wales all those years ago. But, maybe we should have poets on war grounds. I mean, why not? People coming to multidisciplinary team meetings and reading a page from a short story. Why not? I mean, if what we're saying is that the arts are important and that the arts can influence the way in which medicine is practiced, well, then the people who are best placed to stimulate and foster that maybe should have a higher profile in healthcare settings. I mean, going back to the days, where you had the chieftains and the bards, the bards were an integral member of the inner sanctum in a chieftain's household. And maybe to a fault, we have, people who work in the arts have been pushed back, or they have chosen to stay back from the mainstream of activity. But again, talking off the top of my head.
I think something else that can be helpful practically, I know this with my journalist hat on, never, and it sounds quite cold, but never assume anyone cares about what you care about. And find your advocates and your champions. And I also think be aware of your audience. They're different. So if there's a warm and welcoming person in the health setting, be yourself with them. But if you're dealing with clinicians who are feeling very clinical, don't expect them to buy your belief that art's wonderful just because you believe it. Like, I obviously believe it, but it's tailoring the message to the audience. There was a project about 10 years ago called Open Window up at the oncology unit in James's, and they were using video screens in isolation wards to show art. And because it was so enclosed, they were able to do a controlled scientific analysis of it. And that's the only way to talk to people who only understand empirical fact.
Right. So, and could I turn that right around, Gemma, and just say that maybe tailored with that is maybe a belief that a lot of people will actually have positive regard for the arts, but just don't feel in a position to express it. Yes. And again, going back to my time at the medical school in UL, when students were obliged, as they were, this was a compulsory module, to engage with the humanities and actually do something and produce something. It was extraordinary, both what they produced, but also the impact, because they had to do some kind of a statement as to what it meant to them to have delivered on this project. And, people who had been dancers when they were in their teens and had had to forgo that because they got stuck in academia, to be freed up to actually do something. People, producing works of art to sometimes a very high standard, but even if they weren't to a high standard, the release that people got from being able to express themselves, creativity was quite enormous. And I do think that if you were able to free people up, I think you'd find that there's an enormous, I would say the majority of people would be with you on that.
That actually touches on a question in from the Anam Creative Arts Hub about they'd love us to talk a little, or you to talk a little, about art in everyday health in terms of prevention instead of cure.
Yeah, I suppose, the obvious thing to talk about is people's mental health. But again, I think, there is a science that is starting to be looked into in terms of physical health as well. A colleague of ours, Roseanne Kenny, has just written a book published in recent days, where she talks about the determinants of health in older people and talks about things like friendship and creativity, purpose in life, all of these things that can, of course, be facilitated and released by the arts in its various forms. I mean, people joining a choir, the socialization that comes with that, the friendships, as well as, has to be good for all aspects of health, both mental health and physical health. Again, I think we're not mining that for anything like we should, but maybe people are starting to realize and pay attention to that. I'd like to think so.
There's a lovely quote by one of the, I think he's French philosophers, Adorno, and he talks about art's definitive protest against the dominance of purpose in life. And I am a very poor watercolorist, but I really love painting bad watercolors of my horse because it's so relaxing, because it's not for anything. I'm released from the need to be good. It can be pure, whether it's mental flow state or whatever. And I think there's something in there as well, isn't there, about encouraging people.
Yeah. And isn't it sad, Gemma, because, I mean, kids have that innately, don't they? And, your 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 5-year-old, give them a piece of paper and a crayon and a pencil, and they'll amuse themselves, for hours. And again, you can see how stimulating and how rewarding they find that. And somehow or other, we knock that out of people as they go through life. And, it's sad that we do that, but how fantastic it would be to try and partially reverse some of what life prevents us from doing, and re-engage with doing something like getting out the crayons and the pencils, and just for the hell of it, and the release that comes with that. It can only be for the betterment of people's health.
Maybe we should all do something we're really bad at every single day.
I wouldn't push that too far. Someone else are doing that.
I'm intrigued by this question. Did the artists see each other's paintings in the Union Hall collection?
Well, we did produce a book after the first 25. And until then, we didn't encourage people to see what anybody else had done. And in fact, nobody was at all interested in seeing what anybody else had done. So the first 25 paintings that came into the collection, people had no idea as to how anybody else had interpreted the stimulus. Since then, I think people have had the opportunity, because there's a book there. People might have seen this. I'm not trying to promote it because it's long out of print, but it's a book of the first 25 paintings that came from the collection. And so people, have at least the capacity to look at that if they want, but I don't think too many are interested. Actually, it's amazed me. Again, you might have insights into this over the years, but, we've got to know quite a few artists and have had many artists visit the house. And we found them singularly disinterested in the work of other artists, which always kind of surprises me.
A lovely quote. Someone had a meeting with James Joyce, and obviously it's the centenary, and they said he only became animated when talking about himself.
Yes, and maybe too much of a focus on the work of others stifles your own creativity. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to me.
There's a question from Niamh O'Regan, which we touched on in when I mentioned the Open Window project. And she's saying, in medicine, we often try to achieve things with a measurable outcome. But she is, like me, very inspired by what you had said about Micheál Ó Súilleabháin. Do you have advice on how to let things happen in a productive way?
So is there a question?
In terms of, there's the measurable and there's the qualitative, and then there's the trusting in serendipity, but giving it a nudge in the right direction from time to time.
So again, I'm struggling just to identify the question.
I promise there's a question wrapped up in there somewhere, right. And I've mangled Niamh's original question, but I suppose what's behind it.
So Niamh is saying, how are you, Niamh? It's the letting. Again, just to restate what I said earlier, and again, when I first heard him talk about this, I mean, it did seem to resonate with me. And, I suppose one of my failings in life is, flitting from one kind of project to another. My dear brother-in-law has explained that I have the attention span of a gnat. But, in all of that, I think I have maybe, a tendency to become enthralled by other people's ideas and to try and encourage them to explore those. Again, that's something that I saw in spades with Micheál Ó Súilleabháin. I mean, Micheál would always have said that, if he got praise for everything that happened in the World Academy that he had nothing to do with, he'd be have a very swelled head. And he said, that a lot of the time what he was given credit for was the work of others, but that he had actually encouraged and facilitated and not said no to. So that's maybe, again, restating what I said earlier.
Do you think there's also something about when you're engaged fully, you're more alert to what's around you? Because, if you imagine we're in the river, and if you're alert to gold, you'll see the nuggets.
I'd have to think about that, Gemma. You obviously believe that. I suppose what I try to do is, when I'm engrossed in something, is to put on the blinkers and just focus on that. And the opposite of what you're saying, kind of filter out all the noise that might interfere with that. But I think after a period of intense concentration where you are focused on something, and when you do take the blinkers off, I do think your awareness and your perception might, for a period of time, which might be minutes or might be hours, might be different. What I find is an engagement with nature is the thing that really helps me in my kind of madness with ideas which some people might kindly, say are occasionally creative. I think the other thing is sport and doing something that's physically demanding. I cycle a bit, and when I'm out on the bike, that's when kind of the mad ideas tend to get generated. But equally, the time when the truly mad ideas get discarded in favor of those that are just slightly less mad. So I think something like sport can be very useful in that regard. Or anything else like, that focuses the mind.
Time for two more questions. From Adele Nolan, was there a moment when you realized that you were going to be an art collector and that art was for you, or was it a growing thing?
Yeah, I'm still struggling with the whole idea of being an art collector, Gemma, and maybe again privately we could have a conversation about this. I recently helped a student who was doing a PhD on the psyche of people who collect art, and as I understood it, the thesis was that people who collect art are really quite stunted psychologically, and that there are some major deficits in their psyche that is somehow or other compensated for by collecting. I wouldn't want to regard myself genuinely as a collector in the sense of being a hoarder. I would rather try to present the notion that you're a custodian. And, that, I'm in my kind of mid to late 60s now. Presumably I've got limited time on this earth. The paintings that Aileen and I have collected, we've decided won't fit into the coffin with us. So, they'll clearly be passed on. And so I think in all of this, I think people who collect can serve a useful role in society in, bringing things together, certainly in helping artists to survive and to continue to produce art. And I think that is important, in the same way, of course, that people who go to concerts or people who go to, buy books in the library are facilitating the arts. And I don't think it's really anything to be ashamed of. But, the whole notion of a collector is something that I think I'd need to try and sort out in my own mind. I mean, as I say, a collector in the sense of being a custodian, I buy into. A hoarder, I try to make sure that that doesn't happen.
And a final question, and I'm sorry to everyone whose questions we didn't get a chance to get to. Aisling Kennedy, which I find really fascinating. The medical students who were opposed to the humanities, did you win any of them around, or did they remain steadfast?
Certainly there was a hardcore who to this day would feel that this was madness, and in an overcrowded curriculum where there was so much to learn, that this was absolutely a waste of time, and were vehemently opposed to it. And I think, there's a hardcore in relation to everything. I'm aware of, the resistors in life versus the opponents. I think resistors serve a function in that they make you question what you're doing, justify it to yourself, justify it to others. And I have no problem with resistors to any idea. I think they serve a very useful function. Opponents can be more challenging and more difficult, but certainly I think you will find graduates of UL, hopefully not many in number, who will to this day feel that this was outrageous. Now, I think the great majority would not share that view, and that's fine. That's the way the world works, I think.
And have you had time to notice any difference in their careers?
Haven't had time to, no. And maybe it won't happen immediately. Maybe it'll happen down the road. I do remember as a medical student, my best friend worked with a GP who, in the middle of his surgery, would close off the books for 15 minutes, play the fiddle, and then go back to treating his patients again. Got a very good friend, Manus Maguire, who's a musician of the very highest caliber, now retired in Clare. And Manus would, for 3 months of each year, give up his general practice and would go off to the States and play music on the college circuit. And he would argue very vehemently that his ability to devote 3 months of his life each year to music was an extraordinary benefit to him in his medical career. Certainly prevented him from burnout and made him a much more enthusiastic and better doctor. So again, many practical examples of how the arts can be integrated into people's daily work. And, so I can see Niamh O'Regan and Rena Mulcahy and co closing the doors and getting out the fiddle or the Jules harp, or Rena has the piano, so maybe 15 minutes on the piano and away you go again. It certainly, I think, would rejuvenate a lot of people when energy levels are flagging.
Oh, I don't want to stop, but we have to. And I think that's a very beautiful place on which to stop. And I want to thank you, Paul, so much for those insights, the feedback from the questions. I think people have really taken a lot away from what you've had to say, but that's also a measure of what you've done throughout your career. And it's really important and beautiful. And I want to thank Claire and Maeve and everyone at the Waterford Healing Arts Trust, and all of you for joining us and for your wonderful questions. And I will hand back to Claire now.
Just before you go, Gemma, I have an audience now of 23 people who are witnesses to the fact that you've agreed to contribute a watercolour to the Union Hall collection. So we look forward to that next year.
I promise.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all for coming along to this event today. This has been just a super conversation. Took touching on the appreciation of art on the walls of the hospital, the benefits of engaging in art making and bringing the arts into medical education. So that's really, really great. Thank you so much. I'd just like to mention the Union Hall collection again, and that lovely book that Paul showed us earlier. I gave a copy to the general manager here at the hospital last year when we were talking about accepting the loan, and I've never seen a reaction like this from her, but she actually skittered with excitement when she read that book and took that book, and she's so happy that the loan is here as well. The work is so special, and what I love about it is that it really kind of showcases the diversity within the arts and the fact that all of the artists have interpreted the same view of Union Hall, and they've all come up with something so different. The work is now on view in a long corridor within the hospital, and the engagement, as I said earlier, with the collection is just so amazing. So thank you, Paul. There are lots more events and arts experiences as part of the Well Festival, so please check out wellwaterford.com, and the festival running from the 7th to the 12th of February. And just picking up on one of the points that was mentioned today, there is a doodling for wellbeing online tutorial that might be of interest to some of you as part of the programme as well. I'd like to say a quick word of thanks to our funders, the Arts Council, the HSE, Waterford City and County Council, and offer a special word of thanks to my colleague Maeve for all her work in pulling the festival together. Thanks also to our wonderful festival partners, Garter Arts Centre and Waterford Libraries. And a huge thanks to Dr. Paul Finucane and Gemma Tipton. You've been so generous with your conversation today. And finally, I'd like to thank you all for coming along and joining us this evening today. Thank you so much. Bye. Bye-bye.